Right, good afternoon, year 13. This is the second time I'm doing this recording today, as the last one corrupted, so let's hope this one works really well. I'm going to be going through the Othello mock question with you. I'm going to be going through the title and how to answer it. I'm going to be looking really closely at the idea of performance in the text, and I'm going to deal with quite a lot of context as well, in particular race and culture. I'm going to be looking at post-colonial theory a little bit and how you might apply that to Othello. And as I go through the passage, emphasizing on different AO2 aspects and AO3 context, I'm also going to be suggesting links to the rest of the play. However, because that's very complex, I might back that up with a second recording where I look at Roderigo and Brabantio in a lot more detail. Now let's just quickly look at the question now. I know a lot of you were disappointed when you opened the paper and you saw the names Brabantio and Roderigo. And I spoke to my class quite carefully about this. We're very happy that we gave you a question like that, not because we're sadists, but because we wanted to remind you that there can be surprises in an exam. One of the key exam skills is not to panic when you see something unfamiliar. Questions can sometimes be phrased in very unfamiliar ways, and it is conceivable that you get rather minor characters within a question. I think the thing to remember then is that everybody is in the same boat as you, and it's an opportunity to really think laterally and bring in things that may not obviously be connected, but which you could make connected through, clever phrasing. So let's look at Brabantio and Roderigo today in a lot of detail. I don't think it's as hard as many of you thought. I think in particular Roderigo appears in the play numerous times, maybe not significantly, but interestingly enough for you to be able to bring up. And you can always contrast him with Iago, who is obviously his kind of puppet master, and Roderigo is also a kind of comical character in many ways. Brabantio, on the other hand, is obviously largely confined to the first act. We only see him in detail twice, and yet the court scene is so important that you could at least write perhaps 1 or 2 paragraphs on that, because it's so significant in relation to this particular passage that we're going to look at today. Now, the most important thing in with any question, but particularly with the Shakespeare one, is to read the title really carefully and to remember that all literature essays, whether they ask for it or not, require an argument. And your job immediately within any kind of introductory paragraph is to show how you're going to answer this question. Now, in particular, this is quite a complex question. It says Brabantio's role as Desdemona's father and Roderigo's role as a suitor. Don't forget Roderigo had asked for a hand in marriage before this. Suggests that they both love Desdemona. Well, you've studied love for nearly 2 years now, so you know it's perhaps the most complex word in the English language. And so a kind of definition of what you mean by love is absolutely obligatory in this particular question. So you get that very sweeping statement there. And as is often the case in these kind of essay titles, it's then heavily qualified. However, all that drives them is possessiveness, jealousy, and pride. 3 very negative nouns, all of which you may not necessarily associate with love, because if we think about idealistic love and the kind of Greek idea of agape, then you might be thinking about things like unselfishness and looking after someone else's welfare. However, your reading of literature will show you that that's seldom the case in love. And when you're thinking about, say, Gatsby and his love for Daisy, you might see elements there of possessiveness, etc., and pride as well. And in fact, I think in most of the literary texts, you'll see that there are very broken elements of love, which are not quite so positive as the more chivalric, worship, devotional kind of mode of love, which is often a highly romanticized representation of love in literature. So we've got possessiveness, we've got jealousy, we've got pride. They're kind of connected, but of course we can split them as well. Now let's not forget, you've got to look at the passage in a lot of detail, and you also have to look elsewhere. And I'm going to start there straight away by saying Ms. Rickson has done an excellent PowerPoint, and I hope you've all had a chance to look at that. And in that PowerPoint, she talks about the fact that in the mock exam, perhaps the weakest thing was not linking to the play. I would say that part of that, I've discussed this with my own class, was a lack of textual knowledge, but also it's kind of missed opportunities sometimes. Now, two things. Firstly, don't structure your essay so that you go through the passage first and then do the links later. You should actually embed it in there. And the second thing is to try and use the passage all the time as your kind of bedrock that you come back to. Now, it's difficult to tell you exactly what the ratio of the passage to the rest of the play is. I think it's probably not 50-50. I think you're going to do the passage more than the rest of the play. If I were to kind of give a speculative figure, I would say it's more like kind of 60% on the passage, 40% on the rest of the play. So do use the passage all the time as your base. Now, before I start, I want to remind you that this is drama, and therefore you must refer a great deal to the performance aspects of the play, both within the passage and elsewhere, and that's a significant element of AO2. Whenever I've marked A-level exams in the past, I've tended, especially on the drama question, to look that students can go from script to stage. Are they able to look at the dead words on the page and imagine them coming to life on the stage? Now, a lot of you as well are sometimes a bit concerned about AO5. You often wonder, how do I get these differing interpretations into my essay? On drama, that's much, much easier. And I'll be talking to you about how you can interpret and kind of be a kind of director as you go through the passage. So I'm going to start off here and say that a good place to start off with any passage-based kind of question, if you know the text, is to contextualize the text, to see the passage within the architecture of the play, to see it in terms of the story arc and why it's so important, what preceded this, and how it connects to other parts of the play later. So the first thing to say here is that it begins quite calmly. Well, it depends on your interpretation. I know thee, Roderigo. Well, that could be read as quite flat. Or we could also read it a completely different way. We have a man, Brabantio, who's a very important man. He's a senior noble in Venice. Venice is one of the most powerful states in Europe. Even though it's small, it has an empire, it has a mighty fleet, it has a banking system. It's a very powerful place. And Brabantio has been woken in the middle of the night. He's disheveled and he's dressed in a nightdress. He was probably disorientated, befuddled, and it may be the case that he's saying, I know thee, Roderigo, and it may be that that's a kind of accusatory tone or even a threatening tone. That would explain Roderigo's kind of pandering to him, which we'll see straight away. There's a huge amount of kind of false humility here immediately. Sir, I would suggest there's a kind of tone of entreaty there. I will answer anything, but I beseech you, if it be your pleasure and your most wise consent. So we've got beseech there, almost as though he's pleading with him. We've got this flattery that of your wisdom, as partly I find it is that your fair daughter. Now, even though this is just an incidental reference to colour, you might, in this particular passage, want to talk about the fact that fair and dark patterning occurs throughout the play. And indeed, Othello even imposes that kind of dichotomy on himself. And here we have the idea of fair as being pretty, as being white, as being associated with beauty and with justice. We will see that that is contrasted and juxtaposed with the imagery of darkness and savagery and of the other that occurs throughout the play. And I think it's worth mentioning there because it's probably one of the most important structural dichotomies in the play. And Roderigo says that it is an odd, even time of night. By this, he means that it's very late, and he's kind of using a contradiction in terms here, which leads us into the sense of this confusion of the moment. Okay, remember that it's nighttime now, and it's not very customary to go and bang on someone's door at this particular time. He says, and at this odd dull watch, he says that your daughter's been transported. Now that's a very important verb. So you'll notice in the PowerPoint that Miss Rickson does, she talks about zooming in. Now, it's not the case that you have to zoom in on too many words, but absolutely key ones. And I would suggest this term here, transported, which would be associated with slavery, with the idea of taking somebody by force. And in this particular context, then, it's used very cleverly by Roderigo to manipulate Brabantio's fears, because it's almost as though his daughter's been sex trafficked in a way, with no worse or better guard than with a knave of common hire. Now, it's interesting here that what Roderigo chooses to concentrate on is the fact that he is a gondola who has taken Desdemona. So he doesn't concentrate immediately on Othello and what a villain Othello is. He concentrates on the gondola and the fact that he's a common hire and a knave. All of this showing kind of low status. Now, if we go back to the class-obsessed times of Jacobean society, when rank and prestige mattered so much, the first thing that Roderigo does to manipulate Brabantio is to show that he's been treated as being below his class, and that his daughter has actually used this gondola, some kind of notorious common thug of a human being, and to take her away. And then from that, he moves on to his next rhetorical strategy, which is also very powerful, of imagining the Moor. Of course, Othello's not named. He's identified immediately as the other. And at the time, of course, Europe's great rivals were the Moorish Empire that was situated in North Africa, a very powerful empire. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but talking about the color of Othello, I don't think is very important because, various critics will discuss whether he's black or brown, etc. I don't see that as particularly important. I think it's far more important that we just see him as a cultural other. Now, post-colonial theorists, and I told you I was going to talk a little bit about post-colonial literary theory, often believe and argue that in European literature there has been a kind of dirtifying of the other, of seeing the other as evil, as low, as savage, as engaged in trickery, slyness, and above all things in sexual lechery. And that's why we see immediately the unnamed Moor is associated with gross clasps. And Desdemona, of course, by contrast, is this small, fair thing in the arms of this dark savage, of the lascivious Moor. When we see Othello speaking of Desdemona later, he actually often represents himself as unschooled in love, as quite old, as waning in terms of, his virility, etc. But here, within the kind of white consciousness of Venice, Roderigo uses this rhetorical technique of representing him as a kind of barbarian who's going to rape and use the daughter. So it's orientated towards bringing out the possessiveness in Brabantio. And we often see that male love has a possessive element to it. If we're talking about feminist theory, we know that feminists often talk about, men as seeking to own women. And if we're to just quickly sidetrack and talk about Gatsby, for instance, it's quite easy to see Gatsby as falling in love with Daisy, at least partly because she's a commodity and her voice is full of money. Here, we see Roderigo cleverly upsetting and manipulating the father by having his treasure, his beautiful daughter, violated by this other. And he actually says, if it be by your allowance, if you've allowed this, then I apologize. Again, there's a lot of humility. What we see is that Roderigo is actually quite skillful in this particular scene. But I'm going to suggest to you that I think that that's less Roderigo and much more to do with the fact that Iago has schooled him on how to behave. And I think when we look at elsewhere in the play, Roderigo's a fool and really somewhat of a clown. And so this scene, which is kind of carefully orchestrated, I feel that we see Iago's brilliance behind it, his strategizing, his sense of theatre. Because one of the big things about this play is it's highly meta-theatrical. It's a play about plays and appearance and the manipulation of appearance, okay? Now here we come to a really interesting bit. I thus would play and trifle with your reverence. Okay, now again, coming back to this language of respect and reverence, etc. All of it very clever and cultivated to get into Brabantio's good books. Contrasted with this reverence, giving him the respect that he feels that he deserved, is his daughter's behavior, which he represents as a gross revolt. Now, I think that's really important because it's a political metaphor, as I write here, and it's a political metaphor in so much as the Jacobean Elizabethan era would have seen the father, the patriarch, as the head, as the king of the family. And like the state, any kind of rebellion would be seen as gross, as despicable, as going against natural law, etc. And that's what Roderigo's playing on here. So this is an important little AO3 point for you here. The household is in revolt. And in particular, to have a daughter revolt against her father in this way is kind of quite a shocking thing. And I'm going to pause there to do a little bit more kind of AO3 context. I want to remind you that often when we write today about Othello, we've got all sorts of cultural assumptions that are going to be very different from a Jacobean audience. We might condemn Brabantio in this particular scene and say that he treats her like a possession, etc. But I don't believe that an audience at the time would have seen it that way. I think when you're writing and you're writing within the context of the time, we have to remember that the idea of choosing your own partner was very unusual if you were especially an aristocrat, because marriage actually did involve alliances and making your household more powerful. So don't forget that. And another thing, if we want to talk about AO5, which is this idea of offering different interpretations, we can actually use the idea of historical change as the basis for AO5. So we could talk about how a modern, a 21st century audience who would be looking at patriarchal discourse like this, they would be able to analyze it and they would probably criticize it and condemn it and talk about the importance of female agency and choice. But in Shakespeare's day, the audience, I think, would have been far more conflict-ridden. They might have understood the power of love because love was an emerging ideology. We know that from Romeo and Juliet, where love is portrayed in some ways quite positively, as quite beautifully. But also, let's not forget that Romeo and Juliet ends in tragedy. And it also, a lot of people get killed on the way. So one of the messages is that kind of private love and private desire is also very dangerous. And likewise in Othello, Desdemona's decision to leave her household is going to have tragic consequences. So one of the ways of reading this play is to see it as quite conservative and actually to almost agree with this idea that it's a revolt to go against your father's wishes, etc. Now you'll notice that her duty, beauty, wit, and fortunes. So these are itemized again. So if we want to come back to this idea of possessiveness, we see that she is treated as a commodity. She's treated as an item of value. And Brabantio is represented as someone who's been robbed of this. And you'll notice this, it says here, in an extravagant and wheeling stranger. Interesting that we have the term extravagant because it's to do with money, isn't it? And so if the stranger is extravagant and a spendthrift, someone who wastes money, well, in a sense, I think we could see then Desdemona as being the treasure and Othello as being represented as this kind of person who has no impulse control and who has taken possession of Brabantio's prized treasure. Another thing, of course, is he's described as wheeling, which means a kind of trickster, almost like a card player or somebody like that, okay? Now, the interesting thing about that, of course, is that Othello is anything but that. And you might see this as being part of that discourse of the other, of associating the cultural other with sex, with no impulse control, no education, no civilization, etc. And I think that that's precisely what Roderigo is doing at this particular time. And he says here, straight, satisfy yourself. If she be in the chamber of your house, let loose on me the justice of the state. So here he's demanding that Brabantio go inside and search the house. So it's kind of like a real high-octane scene. And I think you need to talk about that when you're discussing the scene, to think about how much energy and passion there is here. And that will now manifest in Brabantio's speech, because clearly some time occurs before Brabantio speaks now. And you'll see he says, strike on the tinder. Now, straight away, you see the trochaic. He changes, it doesn't go unstressed, stressed. It goes straight to stressed, a strong sibilant, strike, strong verb, on the tinder. Ho! That's a shout, an exclamation. Give me a taper, call up my people. So notice there's absolutely no kind of iambic pentameter here, which is the way that in Shakespeare's day nobles tended to be represented as speaking. In fact, it becomes quite chaotic, doesn't it, with these exclamations, etc. This accident is not unlike my dream. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because there's a theme of magic and the supernatural that runs throughout the play. You might want to link this perhaps to the strawberry handkerchief that Othello gets, that's associated with the Egyptian enchantress. And it's part of this idea that maybe the cultural other could only have taken possession of his daughter by some kind of foul means or trickery or supernatural aid. But what's so interesting about that, just before our villain, Iago, comes into the scene, is that Othello is not the villain in this play. And what makes this such a wonderful and amazing play is that Roderigo's description of him is completely deconstructed by Shakespeare. He represents this almost like a kind of racist, prejudiced, external discourse. He shows somebody manipulating and using stereotypes to vilify someone who's in fact honorable. And all of these qualities that he actually, projects onto Othello are really aspects of his own being. Because we know that Iago is able to manipulate Roderigo by talking about how much he wants to enjoy her. So when he imagines her little Desdemona in the arms of the lascivious Moor, it's almost like he's projecting his own sexual desire onto her. And I found that very interesting because we don't on the whole see Othello behaving like that in a physical way. There's only one part, and that's when he thinks that she's an adulteress, when he starts to speak to her in a crude way. Before that, he speaks to her using the language of chivalric love, which is meant to be the language of the West, of course, isn't it? Okay. Now, when Iago enters, I'm going to say a few things. I know the question is on Roderigo and Brabantio, but I'm going to say a couple of things about Iago, and I'll justify them to you in a moment. Yeah. He says, farewell, for I must leave you. It seems not meet nor wholesome to my place to be produced. As if I stay, I shall against the Moor. Now, when you have these kind of thesaurus, these hyphens over here, earlier we saw thesaurus being used with Brabantio. In his case, I would suggest that that's about kind of panic, and it shows the breakup of his reason. But notice when Othello speaks, it's almost as though he's choosing and picking his words so carefully. Nor wholesome to my place to be produced, pause. As if I stay, I shall against the Moor. He's such a master strategizer. So why have I told you about Iago when the question is about Roderigo and Brabantio? Well, I think it's worth contrasting Iago with Roderigo. And what you'll see is, in this scene that we've looked at, I can't help feeling that Roderigo, as I say, is parroting what he's been told to say by Iago. This is the master strategist. And Roderigo, who is manipulating Brabantio here, I don't think later in the play is capable of being so shrewd. I think he's been schooled into these lines by the vice-like Iago, who is so good at manipulating appearances. Moving to the second page then. Now, I won't say too much more about this, because again, as I said, the passage really is about Roderigo and Brabantio. But one thing that is interesting in the passage is it reminds us of the wars. And I think that that's absolutely key to understanding Othello's character, because as I've said before, Othello is an outsider. In many ways, he comes from a culturally despised position. But he has such curious status in the play, doesn't he? He is absolutely integral to Venice's survival against the very powerful Islamic forces which are threatening it at the time. So you have this extraordinary kind of position where Venice's welfare depends on a cultural outsider. So Othello therefore becomes a kind of insider who's protecting Christendom and Venice, but as we know, his origins are that of the outsider. And it's this kind of identity confusion that is going to be his undoing. And the reason why I mention it here is because Roderigo shows us how Othello's race is key to his undoing, how he can be vilified and besmirched, because this discourse of hatred and racism of the cultural other is available to his enemies. And his enemies are able, his antagonists are able to play upon these prejudices. Now, as I said, what fascinates me about this is that Shakespeare, instead of showing Othello as the kind of villain, instead shows Iago, the insider, the Venetian, as the real villain. And I would remind you that it's important not to see Christianity as monolithic, as one thing, because at this point there are huge wars being fought between the Catholics and the Protestants. And Protestant England very often represented Catholic Europe as deceitful, as tricky, as tactical, essentially as a kind of Iago-like figure. And in particular, English writers would represent the Italians as Machiavellian characters. Machiavelli was the Italian writer that said, what doesn't matter is what's in your heart. What matters is how you appeal to people. And when we think about honest Iago, that I'm using that term ironically, we are aware of the fact that Iago is such a brilliant actor. And as I said, this is a highly meta-theatrical play. It's a play about plays. It's a play about appearances and about perception and how flawed our perception is and how easy it is for a kind of director like Iago to manipulate us. And who's manipulated the most by Iago? Roderigo and later Othello. Now returning to Brabantio, here we see he is completely hysterical by this time. It is too true and evil, she's gone. And he says, and what's to come of my despised time? Now this is interesting, isn't it? As I've said here, it's very selfish, because he immediately personifies time and his old age as a despised time, because he's not going to have his beautiful, loving daughter there to entertain and make his old age, his dotage, pleasant. Instead, he sees it as naught but bitterness. So his first thought is not, of course, for Desdemona. If she was in the arms of this terrible, hideous rapist manipulator, you might think he would be incredibly concerned about her. But his first thought, which shows his possessiveness and his jealousy, is for himself. Where'dst thou see her go? O unhappy girl, with the Moor thou sayest, who would be a father? Notice how the hyphens here, we saw them earlier with Iago, but here they're very different. Here they show the thoughts are haphazard and jumbled. With the Moor, sayest thou? Who would be a father? How dost thou know 'twas she? Oh, she deceives me past thought. What said she to you? Now, two things here. Well, firstly, as I said, we see the disorder, etc. We could argue that this is the possessiveness that we see, but at the same time, this is genuine emotion. And this is a kind of love, isn't it? And who's to say that love is always pure? As I said before, love often has elements of possessiveness, etc. When we think to Act 5, Scene 2, later we know that Brabantio dies, and Graziano says, his brother says that he died of a broken heart because of Desdemona's actions. If we to take him at his word, then he is genuinely distraught in this particular way. And of course, this is going to lead directly to the court scene where he's going to make the charge that Othello has used some kind of charms. What's interesting, as we'll see in the court scene, though, is his representation of Desdemona is not what she appears to be. When he speaks of her, it's as this girl who would be frightened at looking upon Othello. But when we see Desdemona, she speaks in a highly male public realm. She sides with her husband, and she sides against him. So it's absolutely key that we see that in many ways Brabantio doesn't know his daughter. Now Roderigo says, truly, I think that they are. So of course there he's winding him up, using a slightly poor phrase. He's upsetting him and getting him ready. Now all the time Roderigo is hoping that Brabantio will act with rage, that he will attack Othello, etc. Yes, sir, I have indeed, he says here. Call up my brother. Oh, would you had her. Some one way, some another. Do you know? Where may we apprehend her and the Moor? So desperate. And again, this leads directly to the trial scene, which you'd have to talk about here, because he's in an absolute state of rage and despair. Roderigo says, I think I can discover him if you please. Now, this is part of a pattern of behavior that we're going to see throughout the play. It's one that Iago uses all the time, which is when people are in a state of despair or when they're slightly confused, they often lean on somebody. And Roderigo here says, yes, I'll be your servant, I will help you. And Brabantio, who is not in a fit state of mind to be sort of skeptical, immediately takes this offer up. Now, you could also, of course, use this to show how Iago is the person who understands people's psychological vulnerability and is able to insert himself as a kind of advisor, guardian during these periods of existential despair. And Brabantio here in his final speech says, pray you, lead on. So we see Roderigo has been successful. Now, this is the only time he's successful because normally he is led on by Iago. So once again, I can't help feeling that behind this is Iago, and it's almost like he has written the script. Elsewhere, we'll see that Roderigo is not capable of such subtle manipulation. At every house I call, I may commend at most, get weapons, ho, and raise some special officers of night. Oh, good Roderigo, I'll deserve your pains. Notice here as well, something that play shows us, that if you pretend to be someone's friend, quite often when they're in a state of distress, they will uncritically accept that invitation. And so the scene ends in complete disorder. We're reminded that the private and the public are intimately related. So that scene, I think I've more or less tried to capture that scene. I hope you've seen I talk a lot about performance. I think about the pauses and what's happening on the stage. And that is very important. In the next video, I'll talk more about the scenes that feature Roderigo and Brabantio that you might have used to link to. Thank you for listening.